Our next speaker is Ryan Diener, and he is the state coordinator for Quail Forever in Arkansas, and he will be talking about pollinator planting establishment. So Ryan, if you would please share your screen, we can get started.
All right, thank you, Leslie, for the introduction. And as she said, my name is Ryan Diener. I'm the state coordinator for Quail Forever down here in Arkansas. I get the honor and privilege of getting to work with all these fine folks that you've heard from here recently, and that includes Leslie as well. So everybody's been doing fantastic. These have all been excellent presentations today, and hopefully I can provide some good info for everybody too. So when it comes to establishing natives here in Arkansas, especially pollinator and monarch habitat, I really like to have people ask themselves, so what are we doing and why? And when it comes to these natives, we really want to focus on these native forbs and broadleaf plants for our native pollinators that are in need, and specifically those that are native to our Arkansas natural communities, and ideally native to the communities in which where we're actually doing the plantings. It's important to note that these native plants come in a huge variety of colors and shapes, in different sizes, blooming at different times of the year, and they provide critical food and shelter for a lot of our wildlife species here in the state, including all of our pollinators, but same with small mammals, grassland birds, forest and woodland birds, and so on. And we have a large variety to choose from. I know this number is not exactly on, and it's probably more than this, but there's been well over 800 species native plants, most of them forbs, documented in our Arkansas prairies, savannas, and woodlands. So for establishment, there's really 4 key things that people need to consider when they're thinking about planting back monarch and pollinator habitat or like a prairie restoration project. First and foremost, it's what are you going to plant? Picking those species and the amounts of things you're going to plant and at what proportions. And there's some aspects to that we'll get into. Site preparation is absolutely key to being successful in your establishment. Knowing when to plant, and we'll just say outright that dormant season is by far the most preferred. And then how to plant these species. So native seed is quite a bit different from, crop seed or other typical seed that folks might be used to planting. And if we're doing diverse mixes, we're going to be dealing with seeds that are all different shapes and sizes and weights. Trying to get them planted at the same time can pose somewhat of a challenge. But I will say, when it comes to establishment of monarch and pollinator habitat, generally the thing where we fall short on the most and what causes the most frustration with poor establishment or establishment taking a long time is generally due to either lack of or poor quality site preparation. Site preparation is absolutely key, and we'll spend a good amount of time today talking about exactly what we need to do for site prep. So what to plant? There's kind of a few just general rule of thumbs that we have when we're making native seed mixes, or when you're wanting to consider planting natives, that you should try to keep in mind to make sure that we're providing a good seed mix and a good diversity of species, and we're accomplishing that pollinator habitat that we're shooting for. Generally, we're looking at a seed mix that's 25 to 35 pure live seeds per square foot. You really don't want to dip down below 25. If you do, we start getting into rates that are low enough that it's not going to easily suppress the weed pressure that we get here in Arkansas, because we get so much rainfall and we grow so much vegetation every year that we'll have a hard time out competing that. So we generally try to keep 25 seeds per square foot as our minimum baseline. I generally try to shoot for 30 seeds per square foot. It's a nice round number to shoot for, and if you end up plus or minus 1 or 2 from that, you'll be in very good shape. And just based on our standards for pollinator habitat, we need to have at least a minimum of 9 species, but that is absolutely a bare minimum. So that's considering having 3 species in each of the 3 bloom periods, so like spring, summer, and late summer or fall, providing at least 3 things blooming during each of those seasons for our pollinators. We absolutely want to shoot for higher diversity than that, and higher diversity is always going to be better for attracting a greater amount and diversity of our native pollinators. So the more species we can get in the seed mix, the better. That 9 species minimum is exactly that. It's a bare minimum that we have to set, but we should always try to shoot for more species. And then within the seed mix, try not to have any single species exceeding 15% of the mix, and annuals and biennials combined should account for no more than 10% of the mix. So you still want annuals and biennials in the mix. They do a great job of coming up that first growing season and help provide kind of that native nurse crop for the perennials that are in the seed mix as well. And they kind of help suppress some of that weed pressure that we might get otherwise. So those annuals and biennials are absolutely important in the mix. And we generally try to have them in there at 10%. The 15% of the mix on any given species is just so we don't have any individual species just absolutely dominating that site. Some of these natives, might not be necessarily aggressive in an actual natural setting in their ecosystem with all the other competition that naturally comes along with that. But sometimes there are some of these native species that when they're included in a seed mix and reseeded into an area, can compete very heavily and kind of dominate that site, on accident, and we don't intend for them to do so. A couple that might come to mind and that folks have probably seen here in Arkansas, if you're in a wet site, especially kind of like clay ground that holds water through the winter and spring, but then gets dry in the summer, partridge pea can be very competitive on those sites, and even though it's an annual, can come up extremely thick and be very dominant on those clay, seasonally wet sites in like East Arkansas. And on similar sites like that, we've also seen the same issues with false sunflower. So oxeye false sunflower can get that way as well and cause issues if it's included in the seed mix at too high of a rate. And when we do that, we're just outcompeting the other species that we've included in that seed mix to the detriment of our own diversity. And also when we're making these seed mixes specifically for pollinator monarch mixes, but I really hold this to be true for any of our general wildlife seed mixes, we try not to have native grasses make up more than 25% of the mix, unless there's a specific reason why we're planting natives other than for pollinator monarch or wildlife habitat, like if you're doing a native pasture planting or perhaps if you wanted some type of thicker cover on certain places of the farm, but generally we're wanting to limit those native grasses, especially in our pollinator monarch mixes, to no more than 25% of that total mix. And it is perfectly okay to plant a monarch and pollinator mix that is 100% forb. We don't have to include native grasses. In most cases here in Arkansas, you'll have some type of native grass come in that field anyway. And a lot of times, even just buying native forb mix, you might be surprised at just how much native grass seed manages to find its way into that bag on accident as well. But we'll often have broom sedge come up into our fields, even if it's not planted. It's there in the seed bank, it'll come in, as well as like purple top, which is another native warm season grass. So we'll have grasses there, and that's not a bad thing. You want some grass. Nature absolutely abhors a monoculture, and that grass will help carry fire into the future too, but perfectly okay to do plantings without any grass in it at all. So when we're picking those species that we want to plant, it's important to keep in mind what your objectives are. We have a lot of choices when it comes to the different types of colors that you may want to see in your field, or the colors at certain times of the year you might want to see. If you want to specifically pick out things of certain wildlife value, like if you want to for sure have species in your seed mix that are beneficial to monarchs are an obvious example, but like a hummingbird mix that has tubular flowers that'll help feed hummingbirds as well. So in that case, you need specific flower shapes as well as flower color. But we can look at those things and consider that when we're picking those species. We also want to consider what your specific site conditions are. Is it dry or wet? Do we have deep soils, shallow soils? Is it rocky? A lot of this is going to change what species you might want to include in your seed mix. The best example of seed mixes that could actually change within a very close, narrow area would be either in the Ozarks or in the Ouachita Mountain regions here in the state. So if you're doing a planting that was on a south or west slope in the Ozarks or a south slope in the Ouachitas, that's going to be very dry, shallow soil site, and we'd want to have specific species that can tolerate that type of site. But we might go 100 yards up over the crest of the hill and find ourselves on a north slope where it's wetter and it has deeper, better soils. We could very well have a very different mix on those two sites. And naturally occurring, we would have different species on those sites and those ecosystems as well. So it makes sense for us to want to look at that and make sure that we're picking the right species that are going to do well on your site. The site preparation. Like I said before, site preparation is absolutely the key element to habitat establishment and planting these natives. We have to eliminate and reduce competing vegetation. If we're dealing with non-native vegetation, we absolutely want to eliminate all of that. But there are circumstances where if it's an area that's mostly native, but maybe it's just an older native grass planting, but it's solid native grass, and we just need to really reduce that competing vegetation to get more forbs in there, then we don't have to completely eliminate and start over, but we do need to hit those pretty hard still. We always want to make sure we have good seed to soil contact with a prepared seedbed. And just right now, I'll say that when we say prepared seedbed, we are not necessarily talking about a tilled seedbed. Our preferred seedbed is a seedbed that's had a prescribed fire done on it recently. So no soil disturbance, burn off the residue that's there, and we should be able to seed right onto that. And we're still going to have great seed to soil contact. But we do need at least 50% bare ground. So if we do site prep, if we do sprayings or other methods, and we have at least 50% bare ground for seed contact, we'll be in good shape. So when we're planting natives, especially forbs, but same with native grasses, fertilizer is not needed, especially nitrogen. Our native vegetation here in the United States and in this area really developed in a low nitrogen environment. For the most part, if we add nitrogen, we're just going to be giving a step up to weedy native annuals or weedy non-natives that would still come up on that site from the seed bank too. So adding fertilizers, especially nitrogen, is not necessary, and it could be detrimental to the actual establishment of that stand. Phosphorus and potassium could be added if the tests show that it's severely low, but probably not necessary in most cases either. And the same goes for liming. Unless you're required to do so by program guidelines, I don't recommend applying lime to establishment areas for native vegetation. If you're planting forbs and native grasses, if we've done our work and picked species that grow well on the types of soils that you're dealing with in your area, whether it's slightly acidic or slightly basic, we should have species that do well on that soil site, even if it is slightly acidic. So a lot of times, if you send in a soil test, it's going to say that you need lime, but a lot of our native species are adapted to those soils, and we can make a seed mix that'll do perfectly well there. And again, if we condition that soil to a point, we're just going to be giving a leg up to the weedy species and non-natives that we don't want present on that site. So I'm going to talk real quick about a few different types of seedbed situations that we'll find here in the state. Either killing fescue or Bermuda sod, which is usually our most common seeding situation, seeding into crop stubble. which can happen, and we do a bit of that too. And then if you have desirable native species on the site but want to plant more forbs onto that site as well. So for fescue conversion, or any of our non-native grass conversion projects, we're generally dealing, or at least I've always generally dealt with landowners, and we're talking about larger acreages. So, you know, as we talked about yesterday a little bit, there are methods to do this without doing chemical. Most of them will not work as well, and it will be more mechanically driven and might take several years. But our general recommendations are, with a couple of rounds of herbicide, we should be able to have that site prepared and ready for seeding, and then shouldn't need hardly any, if any, herbicide on that site going forward into the future. So with a couple of good, well-timed, specific applications, like move into this native seeding and then be done with that. So I think it's well worth it, and these can be, again, used correctly. These herbicides work very well. They're not going to be a detriment to your landscape. Fescue, of all of our native grasses, is really probably our easiest one to get rid of. With everything, we recommend at least 2 treatments to make sure we get rid of it, because you're going to have seed from those species near the surface of the soil, and they will germinate and grow after we've killed it off the first time. So a couple of applications is always a good idea. So a spring and fall application on fescue works great, and simply a 2 quart per acre application of glyphosate does very well with this. With the spring application, you won't get 100% kill because it's actively growing at that time, but you will set it back, you will kill some of it. And then if we come back in with a fall application, honestly, like right now, this time of year is a great time to spray fescue to kill it. We've had a couple of frosts. It's actively uptaking nutrients back to the roots, and if we spray it with a chemical application right now, we can do a really good job of killing those plants down to the roots and pretty well be done with it at that point. It is a good note here that you'll always want to add some type of surfactant. Here in this case, some methylated pseudol works well. And I also like using ammonium sulfate at 17 pounds per 100 gallons. That really helps the chemical do its job better. So in Arkansas, especially if you're getting well water out of wells that, you know, a lot of our well water, especially in North Arkansas, is coming through like limestone substrates. So that ammonium sulfate helps bind up ions in that water that otherwise would have bound up with the chemical that we're wanting to add to it and make it less effective. So that ammonium sulfate does a good job at making that water more stable for the chemical to more effectively do its job. And you can use imazapic, which is plateau or panoramic, but that's honestly more common if we're just doing a native grass seeding. There are some forbs that are tolerant of imazapic at lighter rates, but there's a lot that aren't either. So if we're doing pollinator monarch plantings, we generally don't include imazapic in our recommendations for that, but it could be useful based on your seed mix, and your biologist could tell you that too. So there's other options with the fescue conversion. It doesn't have to just be glyphosate. We can use Journey, which is kind of a mix of the two, you know, as opposed to having to tank mix it yourself. So Bermuda conversion, this is going to be much more common in central and southern Arkansas. It is definitely a harder species to kill, and Bahia kind of falls in here too and gets taken out pretty well with the same application rate. But Bermuda needs a spring and summer treatment. It can be sprayed this time of year. We've had some good success with fall spraying on Bermuda, again after a frost, but before it goes dormant. So there's a very narrow window, but it can be used and have good success there too. But we found that Arsenal, our imazapyr, is extremely effective on Bermuda, much more so than glyphosate. You can use glyphosate to kill Bermuda, but you're going to have to be using that at a rate double that we use on glyphosate or on fescue. So you'd have to be spraying 4 to 5 quarts per acre, so a gallon or more per acre on glyphosate to be able to kill Bermuda. So we do prefer Arsenal, and if we get it treated in the spring and summer, and then perhaps a fall cleanup spraying with glyphosate if anything comes back. But Arsenal does have some residual time in the soil, so we don't want to spray too late in the year with that prior to seeding. So if you do a third spraying, we try to use glyphosate. Same thing, we want to add that methylated seed oil and ammonium sulfate here as well. And of note, there are quite a few native grasses and forbs that do survive an Arsenal application, especially if we do end up doing one in the fall. We can spray it after the native grasses are dormant and they'll survive that. And Arsenal doesn't kill legumes, so any native legumes in your field would for sure survive that application. There's been some good field studies done out of Georgia that shows several other native forbs that survive Arsenal applications as well. So just some other chemical options, just that standard fall and spring treatment of glyphosate. Fall treatments do work better for both fescue and bahia if you're going to use glyphosate than the spring treatments do. You might see folks recommend using Outrider. Outrider is a chemical that we use if you have issues with Johnson grass. Outrider works very, very well on Johnson grass, and Johnson grass is definitely an issue non-native species of grass that can be very aggressive and definitely hinder establishment. It can get very, very thick. So if you do a spraying in the spring and see that summer you have a lot of Johnson grass coming up, we do recommend using Outrider to control that right off the bat. And then if you have a site that has grasses but some forbs in there that you do like, you can use Select, which is a grass selective herbicide. So we can do things to selectively kill grasses and not harm potentially positive forbs that you have out there as well. So crop stubble applications for site prep. Really the key here is just ensuring that any residue levels left will not limit our seed to soil contact. It's absolutely ideal to plant back to natives following soybeans. Soybeans leave very little residue on the field. We can plant right into that and basically walk away and it will do just fine. A lot of times corn will be fine, but there could be a lot of stubble. But anything else, any of our grass-based crop species, if there is too much residue left over, a lot of times a prescribed burn will take care of that. Or if you have to, you can go in there and rake that off, or even lightly chisel that, and just to knock that down a little bit and get some soil surface exposed. One thing you do want to keep in mind, and this is true for almost any crop species, it's a good idea to look back or check with the grower to see what herbicides they used on the crop that year and even the year before, because there are certainly some common crop herbicides that have some longer residuals, anywhere from 3 to possibly 18 months. So check and see what chemicals were used in that field. If there is a longer residual, it's not a big deal. You can go back in and replant it to a cover crop for a year and then let that go its course, and then we can plant into our natives after that and let that residual wear out on that field if we have to. I will say before I go into the native areas, if you do have a crop field that you're going to plant into and you come look at it in the fall, if there's a lot of green, like winter annuals starting to come up in that field, you should be able to take that out. You might want to do one spraying if you have a lot of winter annual weed pressure in that area. You could spray that out once prior to planting natives, but often that's not a huge issue. Those winter annuals are often native species, and they are annuals, and after that first growing season, they should kind of fade away and go away on their own. So site prep, if we're planting into existing native grasses that are desirable, we still want to set those grasses back. It's important to provide room for our native forbs to grow that we're planting, and they need both above ground room and below ground space. So space for their roots as well as space above ground to get sunlight are both important. We can do several things, and a lot of times with these existing native grasses, it does take several different things to knock them back enough. Once you have a thick stand of existing native grass, those are very competitive, and they're actually quite hard to set back. But a late summer or fall burn is a great place to start. And then you can follow that either with an herbicide application after they've sprouted back to set them back a little bit farther, or even I've had good success with the light disking after that burn to reduce that stand density. This might be the only case that I really recommend light disking, and this is really only in an area that's been planted to those native grasses. If you're dealing with a truly native area that's not had soil disturbance in the past, I wouldn't recommend doing that. But you can also, if you can't burn, haying or grazing in the summer can be very effective, and then followed by an herbicide application. But we have to do something, or probably multiple things, to make sure we set back those native grasses and provide the room for those seedlings to grow. So I just mentioned disking or tilling is not our preferred method for seedbed prep, but if it is the only option that you have and it has to be used, it can be done. If you're going to till a seedbed, you do have to make sure that you cultipack or roll that prior to seeding. You don't want a whole lot of gaps in those large dirt clouds on the ground for seed to fall in and get planted too deep. And then you can go across it and either broadcast or drill into that. But if you till or disc a seedbed, you're just stirring up the soil, and you're going to encourage more weedy competition that first year than we would have had otherwise. So when to plant? Dormant seeding is really the only acceptable option that's widely recognized. A lot of these native forbs need 30 to 90 days of cold, moist stratification before they'll germinate. So, if we're not planting these things till April and May, most of those species are not going to get that cold, moist stratification they need, and they're not going to germinate that first year. So the best months to plant are really December and January. And honestly, you could probably get away with planting here in late November as well. So late November through January is the best. That's going to help us make sure we get that stratification and get the best germination we can out of that seed mix. And if you're planting both native grasses and forbs, it's best to go ahead and just plant those at the same time. There's no need to go across the field twice. Grasses actually do better with a spring planting. But again, the grasses will come in and they will eventually compete very well. We're more interested in making sure forbs do well and get off on the right foot. So that dormant season planting is absolutely the best option. And planting methods, we'll run through this real quick. Broadcasting is definitely a very effective method for planting natives. You do want to make sure you have 50% bare ground if you're going to do this. If you disc beforehand, you need to roll the field before you plant. You can roll the field after, but if you plant in the winter, it's generally probably not necessary if you have good bare ground component. But if you are going to roll it, you have to make sure you have the teeth up. And I don't really recommend dragging or doing anything else. You just run the risk of sweeping seed off the surface or covering it up too deep to where it won't germinate. Broadcasting is definitely probably the best option for small sites. It doesn't make sense to get a drill out for a small seeding. And often, if we're broadcasting, you're probably going to need to find some type of inert carrier. Sawdust works well, sand can work, anything, rice hulls, anything that's inert. We try to stay away from using cracked grains, so like cracked corn or cracked milo. You're just inviting birds to find that seed, and when they're eating the grain that you use as a carrier, they're probably going to eat at least some of your forb seeds as well. So try to stick with an inert carrier to help get you a better distribution. And as you can see in the last couple of pictures here, and I mentioned earlier, these native seeds come in a whole host of sizes and shapes and weights. So you do want to make sure that your seed mix is staying mixed up well, whether when it's in the hopper, whether you're broadcasting or drilling, to make sure you're getting an even distribution. And try not to make too wide of swaths. You will have some that throws farther than other coming out of a broadcast seeder. Your heavier seeds are going to fly farther than your light seeds. So it's not the worst case scenario, but the first several years of a seeding, if you go with wider swaths, you probably will be able to notice strips of species within your field. But after 4 to 5, 6 years, that should start to even out. So it's really not a huge deal, but it will be something that you can notice if you do that. And for grass seed, just a couple notes. A lot of our smoother, free-flowing seeds are usually higher purity and germinate better. So switchgrass, eastern gamagrass, although eastern gamagrass does require dormant seeding, just like a forb seed. A lot of our chaffier seeds have awns, like big blue stem, little blue stem grass, and they're usually a slightly lower purity just because there's more stuff mixed in with that. If you're going to broadcast, deep bearding works great to help improve the flow of those grass species coming through the broadcast seeder. But if you're going to drill, those drills are made to be able to handle that. So it's not necessary to get grass seed deep bearded if you're going to be drilling. And so just some seed equipment. If you're going to use a drill or any seed equipment, ideally it's made to handle natives. So our native drills, native broadcasters have some type of agitator, as you can see there right under where it says drills. That's the inside of that Truax drill there, and it has the agitator inside that box. Truax has that, Great Plains has that. Some of your hay busters have that. You can check your drill boxes and see if it's got one of these agitators. It should do sufficiently well at planting natives. And then some of our broadcasters have those agitators as well. You'll find Truax broadcasters that has that. But a lot of times broadcasters, they're bouncing around the field good enough to where it's keeping things flowing. And then if you're using an inert carrier, it'll help keep things flowing through there too. But there's a whole host of ways that we can broadcast seed onto a field. You can do it out of a fertilizer buggy with an air spreader, a regular broadcast seeder, as long as it'll flow through there for you. Some type of Brillion seeder works good. We've even had people fly on native seed with airplanes. The same folks that will plant cover crops from airplanes have had perfectly good success planting native fields with airplanes too. Honestly, my preferred seeding method is right here on the left of your screen. That's a Vicon pendulum spreader. So it has that arm that sticks out. It's not your typical broadcast seeder, but it's a broadcast spreader. That arm waves back and forth very, very quickly, and it slings the seed out. And it's slinging hard enough that it generally doesn't have as many issues with having bands of light and fluffy seeds in the field. But those Vicon seeders work great. Those are available across the state. The private lands biologists with Game and Fish have these. And if you're working through a biologist here in the state, whether it's Game and Fish or Quail Forever, they should be able to get you access to one of those to use. Or you can drill or hand broadcast or any method. The real key is however you plant natives, you must see seed on top of the ground when you're done. If you can't see any seed on top of the surface of the ground after you've drilled your seed, it's been planted too deep. And there have been instances when people have used a drill and not set it light enough and planted the seed too deep, and largely that field didn't come up and germinate because that seed got too far in the ground and it didn't get the required sunlight to germinate and grow. So planting it too deep is usually only an issue with drills, or if you've tilled your seed bed and not cultipacked it before broadcasting, and then it gets buried underneath those large cracks in the ground too. So want to see seed on top of the ground. That's the key here. And then just quickly here on some new seedling management. First year is important. If you want to, you can plan to mow multiple times first year. Let it get, maybe just above knee high, and then clip it back down to just below knee high. You don't want to take it down real low and clip off any seedlings. And if you let it get away from you and it gets to waist high or better, you're actually best to just let it grow and then try burning it off in the dormant season after everything's gone dormant for the year. And when you're mowing, a flail type mower is preferred over a rotary mower. So a flail type mower is what we're seeing here on the left side of the screen. and it does a better job at chopping stuff up. Your typical brush hog or rotary mower is generally going to leave a lot of residue, or can leave a lot of residue if you let it go too long. So if you have access to a flail type mower, that's definitely preferred. By the time the second growing season's here, you shouldn't need to mow anymore if you were doing it the first year at all. But if you do, definitely have it done early, maybe just once or twice, and call it good. And then you'll always want to use, some selective herbicides or mowing to control any noxious invasive weeds if you have them in your field. But hopefully with good site prep and looking at that beforehand, this shouldn't be a problem. And then long-term management, like we heard Austin just talking about with our forested stands, same thing here. Prescribed fire is our preferred method. Generally, we're talking about burning it no earlier than the second growing season for actual management purposes. So you don't want to do any growing season burns at all while any plant in that field's green until at least after the second growing season. It's perfectly acceptable to do a December or January burn if you have a lot of like annual grasses that came in just to get rid of residue, but everything's dormant at that time of the year, so you won't be hurting nothing. But we generally aren't talking about management burns for a specific reason, for like setting back native grasses until after that second season. And then with burns, fall and dormant burns do very, very well at promoting forbs, getting rid of woody species. Those spring burns often encourage native warm season grasses, so they'll be a little bit detrimental to what our purposes are here. And with that, I'll just go ahead and end and open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Ryan. There's a lot of great questions in the chat box, and our next speaker needs to present. Ryan, I will give you the option to answer the questions in the chat box, or we can continue Ryan's question and answer portion after Connie talks about his case study. I will extend the invitation that if anyone wants to stick around and ask Ryan some additional questions, Ryan, you can go ahead and share your screen again. I know that Ryan has answered a couple questions in the chat box, but just for the recording's sake, I'll probably ask them again so that he can answer them again. What do you think about using wheat or oats as a carrier or nurse plant for seedlings? Seedings, excuse me.
Yep. Nope. Yeah, and I kind of answered some of these in the chat, but I think this would be good to have it out verbally too. So I actually did have a slide in my presentation that I had cut out that talked about nurse crops for these seedings. And oats can make a good one. We actually have oats automatically included as a nurse crop in a right-of-way mix that we've made. So I do like using oats for that if you have to. I will say that we included oats in that right-of-way seed mix because those are generally planted in areas that we want cover more immediately, and we don't want to leave that sit bare for really any period of time. But if this is really just a habitat seeding and it's not some type of like crazy steep slope, I would say it's not really necessary. But you can use oats. Oats work well. I would keep it below 10 pounds per acre on the oats. I think it's in our right-of-way mix somewhere at like 7 pounds per acre on the oats as a nurse crop. I do not recommend using wheat, and there's two main reasons for that. Wheat is allelopathic, so it puts chemicals off in the soils to inhibit other plant growth. So it will actually keep the native seeds that you put in the ground from germinating or growing that season, especially if you planted it very thick, the wheat that is. And then wheat also tends to be able to reseed itself and come back for at least a year, if not two, if you include it as a nurse crop like that. So I really don't like using it for those two reasons. It has those negative effects on the seedlings that first year, and then it does tend to be able to come back and continue to cause some problems moving forward. We don't see that with oats. Oats winter kill, we don't really see a huge issue with them coming back the second year, and they're not as allelopathic if they are at all. like wheat. So oats work fine. We've had some success with native seedings, actually using like milo or even forage sorghum as well, but again at very light rates. You still need to have plenty of sunlight getting in the ground. And the only thing that those are really doing is helping suppress weeds, but at the same time, they are going to somewhat suppress some of your natives that you planted too. So I really prefer just making sure we have a good proportion of annuals in there. And another great option is to include some native cool season grasses. So like Virginia wild rye and Canada wild rye have been used at somewhat heavier rates, and basically is taking the place of a native nurse crop for those seedings as they come in. And a lot of those native cool season grasses aren't nearly as competitive as our native warm season grasses, so they're not going to keep things out of that seeding, but that can be an option too.
Great, thanks, Ryan. What can be used in place of glyphosate?
Yep. So that's going to depend heavily on what it is that we need to get out of the field. And like we had mentioned yesterday, I know Jonathan mentioned it yesterday too during our large habitat panel. You'll hear us when we're dealing with large habitat areas. Chemicals are a great option for getting this done well, and getting it done actually in a very environmentally friendly manner. So much more friendly than going out and having to heavy disc a field 4 times in a single year to kill out some of these things, and you're still not going to completely kill them out. So that disking disturbs our soil microbes and soil fungi, causes runoff and stuff like that. Really much more detrimental than a couple applications of chemicals. And as far as a lot of our chemicals go, our recommendation for Bermuda being Arsenal. Arsenal is a much harsher chemical than Roundup is. Arsenal has to be used, and they all have to be used according to the label. We absolutely will always tell people you need to follow your label rates. Do not spray these near surface water. Do not spray these before a rain. We don't want runoff. We don't want to cause any issues. Arsenal needs to be handled with much more care than glyphosate does. Arsenal definitely is soil active, and it can cause some issues if you get rain on it too soon afterwards. And it can kill hardwood trees if you spray it underneath their drip line. Whereas Roundup, being a contact herbicide, is actually much safer. Doesn't have soil residual like Arsenal does. So Roundup gets a bad rap, somewhat unjustly, I think. But for our uses here and spraying it, a couple of times to convert an area over to natives and then being done with it, it's a good tool, and it really is not this big bad monster that it gets made out to be. It's not like we're spraying it 3 times a year every year, like in a crop field situation. But it really, if you don't want to use it, it's really going to depend on what species it is you need to take out of that area. There are some other options. If it's a grass, you can try to use a grass selective herbicide. Grass selective herbicides are often not as effective. You'll have more applications that you'll need to make with those to get the job done the same way that we would otherwise. If it's Bermuda Bahia, we do recommend Arsenal. It works better with lighter rates. So that's something that's a good question to have with a biologist on a site visit while you're out there looking at your field and kind of talking through those options.
Great point, Ryan. And we'd like to remind everyone that, there's free technical assistance available to landowners, and just reach out and we'd be happy to connect you to your local biologist. So are these grasses usually eliminated with just one growing season of herbicide application for site prep? And you could probably go through the different species if there's different answers.
Sure. So a lot of them can be, as long as you're doing it multiple times during that growing season. None of the species that we have that are issues that we need to get rid of, like are all of our non-native grasses. We're not going to control any of those with a single application, whether it's chemical, mechanical, or otherwise. It's going to take multiple applications or a full season of some type of application. So whether it's fescue or Bermuda Bahia, if you do at least 2 applications in the spring and fall, or spring and then through the summer for those warm season grasses, you can get rid of them through a single growing season. But you do need to make sure you get at least 2 applications on there. Sometimes we need to do 3. Again, we get so much rain down here and we grow so much herbaceous cover that even if we spray Bermuda in the spring, spray it again in July, by September, you might very well see new Bermuda seedlings coming up again, and we might need to spray it a 3rd time. Now, again, a lot of times that 3rd time, I would recommend not necessarily using Arsenal if we're getting late in the year, but we can use either glyphosate or maybe a grass selective herbicide to take out those seedlings. Seedlings are much less robust than mature plants. So, but you can take care of it in a single growing season. If you're not starting your site prep until fall, if your first site prep application on a site is going to be August, September, October, I highly recommend you do not plant that winter. You need to do it that fall, treat it again next spring or next summer, or go into it and plant like a cover crop or something like that in the area that next growing season, and then go into that area, make sure you control the plants that were there one last time, and then seed it the following winter. Too many times I've seen folks try to do a fall application. It's hard to tell how good of a kill they got because it was fall, stuff was going dormant anyway. They plant, and then they get this huge flush of the same non-native species they were trying to get rid of next spring, and you're going to have a really hard time getting natives established. Or then at that point we have native seed on the ground or seedlings coming up that you spent a lot of money on, but we have this huge flush of all the non-native stuff that we still need to take care of. And now it's a whole different ballgame and much, much more difficult to try to do that without at the same time killing the seed or seedlings that we spent money on too. So much, much better to make sure you get the site prep done and done well. If that takes you one growing season or a fall plus another whole growing season after that, but it's much better to make sure you get that done on the front end before you go in and try to seed.
So the next question is, how long do you have to consider residual herbicides in an area that once had row crops? Our fields were row crops at one time, but when we bought the property, they had been used for grazing and or hay.
Okay. So even the harshest of ag chemicals, the longest residual I've ever seen listed on a chemical was 24 months. So, and I don't believe that was one, that's very common, because if you're using something like that, you're going to have to be planting basically the same crop species year after year. So you're not going to have a rotation, and most people now do a pretty good job of doing a crop rotation. So I don't see that very common. Most of our residual herbicides on crops are anywhere from 3 to 12 months. I have seen some at a year and a half, but if it was crop field in the past and it's been pasture or hay ground now for a year or two, you are well in the green, and easily able to go out and do what you need to do. And then the herbicides that we recommend using for conversions, glyphosate has no residual effect in the soil whatsoever. It's contact herbicide, so it only kills whatever green leaf material it lands on when it lands on it. Arsenal can have some residual effect for a few months, but as long as you're not spraying it in October, November and trying to seed into it that winter, you should be fine. But even if you do that and you seed that winter and that stuff's not germinating until the following spring, still probably fine. But we try to limit that potential as much as possible. But yeah, most of your crop herbicides you're well outside of any danger zone after a year.
Great answer, Ryan. So our next question has been answered twice in the chat box, but for the recording, where can you get rice hulls? I've not been able to find them, and they need approximately 100 pounds. You could probably just expand and talk about all inert material if you want to.
Sure, and I think Bubba answered that. So, if you go to a farm and home store, a lot of times you can find rice hulls. They might be selling it, in loose, 50-pound sacks or something like that, but they'll sell it for bedding and other stuff too. So you can find that. Use rice hulls if you can. I try not to use rice bran. Obviously, rice bran's readily available because it's used, for deer feed and stuff too. But rice bran, that stuff is almost like a powder. It can also bridge, and I've had a hard time with it not wanting to necessarily go through broadcasters real well. And in drills, you don't need to have a lot of bulking agent. Hopefully, they're made to use that native seed. So rice hulls work great. You can go to a farm and home store and ask about it, or a feed store if you have one locally, or if you're out in or near East Arkansas, you can drive out to a rice processing facility and ask them about that there. They might let you drive away with a whole truckload of it. So those are places I would look for that. Otherwise, fine pine shavings, basically sawdust, work well. Those can be found at any farm and home store. Just make sure it's the fine ones. You can go to any sawmill and probably ask for a truckload of sawdust there too, and they might charge, they might not, but things like that work absolutely great. And those are probably the two most widely used types of inert carrier that we see.
So aside from, going off of that, Ryan, aside from rice bran, is there any commonly recommended carrier material that you don't recommend? And also, how much filler do you recommend using?
Okay. I do not recommend using any type of cracked grain. So that's, I specifically say you should get inert carrier. So what I mean there is anything that's not, readily used as a food source and it's not going to grow. So don't use cracked corn. Don't use rolled or cracked milo. The general recommendation for not using those stems from, if you're going to go out and spread 10 pounds to the acre of corn and milo, you're just inviting, birds and small mammals to come and feed on those locations. And if you have a giant flock of birds or a whole bunch of small mammals that are taking advantage of a food resource that just got put out on the ground, they're going to take some of your native seed that you put out there with it too. So just to avoid seed predation, I avoid trying to use those types of carriers. So stick with something that's an inert carrier. Again, sawdust and rice hulls work fine. I've seen people use soybean hulls, stuff like that. Even just chaff can work if you can find it. But generally, for inert carrier, for bulking up your seed, there's two common methods people will go by. So your total volume of seed, if you have enough seed that fills 2 5-gallon buckets, at a minimum, you want to get enough carrier that fills 2 5-gallon buckets as well. So you're doubling the total volume of your seed that you're trying to spread. Or if you're going to drill, or even if you're broadcasting, if your seed mix total weight was 3 pounds per acre, try to get enough inert carrier to add 7 pounds per acre. So you try to bulk up your seed and carrier combined to be 10 pounds per acre. And that makes it easier for you to calibrate your broadcaster or your drill to make sure you're using that material efficiently and getting it spread. So, and the whole point of using the carrier, a lot of that native seed will flow through broadcasters fine, especially if there's an agitator. The point of the carrier is to make sure that you're getting enough bulk material that you're not going to accidentally spread all of your seed over half of your field, and then you're out of seed and you've only done half of the acres you're supposed to do. So you just essentially doubled up the rate of seed on half of your field and the other half didn't get seeded at all. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. So the bulking material is just to help make sure you can more easily spread seed across the entire field. And my recommendation is always better to have to go over the field twice to spread all the seed over it, as opposed to running out before you get done. So it's really just making sure that you have enough material that you can easily spread it out and not run out before you're done.
Great point, Ryan. So can we burn every dormant season the first few years during establishment?
Yes, you certainly can. So I believe I said you for sure don't want to do like a growing season management burn until after the second year, and I'll stick with that. So very unlikely that you're going to have anything becoming an issue in the first 2 years. You'll need to do a growing season burn to set something back. But in those first several years, I think it's perfectly acceptable to do those dormant season burns in like December and January. The key is, depending on where you're at in the state, it might be a little bit harder for folks in South Arkansas to accomplish this, but you want everything to be dormant. So if you're in far South Arkansas, there might be some things that stay warm enough to where they never fully go dormant. Some of these native species, even when they get snow on them and snow on the ground in the winter, they might have basal leaves that still look green, but a lot of times they're a different color green or they kind of turn purplish. Those have gone dormant, and you're not going to hurt those if you burn those off. And a lot of times they won't burn off completely anyway, or they'll just brown down. But a dormant burn after the initial growing season or even the first several, you're not going to hurt nothing. All we're doing is getting rid of that thatch layer of, annual grasses or whatever it was that came up that year. So we're not going to impact that field or the species growing there one way or the other. But yeah, that should be perfectly acceptable. And we can look here again, perhaps at this chart, and I can make this full screen so it's a bit easier. This chart's pretty handy and pretty helpful. So you'll see the management objectives there on that left-hand column, and then the months of the year across the top. So to me, the ones you want to focus on here is stimulating legumes and forbs in warm season grasses. And it shows basically November and December through February and March. I will admit this chart was made up in Missouri, so it probably is off a little bit. Honestly, I would cut off what I would call true dormant season burning at the end of February here in Arkansas. By March, things are green, especially in woodlands. Our woodlands and forests have a lot of spring ephemeral species that sprout and bloom and start growing very, very early before the trees get leaves on them. So those early spring burns can be fairly detrimental to our spring herbaceous plants in our woodland systems. And the same's true on prairies down here too. So dormant burns, you're not going to hurt much. You'll stimulate forbs. You won't necessarily set back native grasses. If you want to thicken stands of grass, you burn it March, April, and May. That'll make stands of native grass get thick. If you want to set back native grass, you burn August through November. And that's the same time frame for stimulating good forb growth as well, as that mid to late summer through fall and dormant season.
Thanks, Ryan. So to go, I believe it's off the carrier question again. Have you had any success using buckwheat?
Well, that depending on if they're talking about as a carrier or as a nurse crop. I've considered using buckwheat potentially as a nurse crop, but I haven't yet. I don't see why it couldn't work. I don't believe it's allelopathic. You could use it as a light seeding rate. The one thing that I would watch out for is, it's buckwheat for a reason. Deer do really enjoy eating that stuff, and if you get a lot of it in your field, you will encourage deer browse. And if that's an issue you're already having in your area anywhere, if you have a lot of deer, planting something that's going to encourage even heavier browse on young growing seedlings might be a bad thing.
Yes, and just to clarify, he was meaning buckwheat for a nurse crop, but right. Excellent point, yep. You covered that. Is there a list of native seed vendors or providers for Arkansas?
There are, and I'm sure Leslie would be happy to send that out to the participants. So all the Quail Forever biologists, we have a list of seed vendors that we maintain. We don't really have any large seed vendors that are actually in Arkansas. So our list of seed vendors for purchasing native seed is largely, is basically exclusively out-of-state seed vendors, but almost every state around us has seed vendors that you can purchase seed from. Missouri has several, Oklahoma, Texas, Kentucky, Illinois, Kansas. So we do have a good list of vendors to choose from, and Leslie can either send that out, or you can talk to either your game and fish or private lands biologist or your Quail Forever biologist in your area and get that from them as well.
Yes, and to build on that, I will encourage folks, if they are receiving that native seed vendor list, to also reach out to your local biologist so that you ensure that you're getting the right recommended seed mix for your specific area in Arkansas. Right seed, right place, right time. And it's free, so reach out for that free technical assistance. If you have a good first year seedling response and a light patchy crabgrass response in a pollinator planting during the first year, is it better to burn the first dormant season or to let it go another year?
Okay, I missed the first part of that question.
That's okay. It's a long one, and I didn't say it right. So if you have a good first year seedling response and a light patchy crabgrass response in a pollinator planting during the first year, is it better to burn the first dormant season or to let it go another year?
You won't hurt it if you burn in that dormant season. Again, I am specifically talking about December and January. If you cannot get it done in December or January, do not do it. If you're getting into February and March, and especially into April, do not burn after that first season, because you will have young seedlings that you will kill and set back. So the only acceptable time to burn after the first growing season is December and January. You're not going to hurt it if you get it done at that time. If it's patchy enough to where it won't burn or it's hard to burn, then it's not necessary to even worry about burning it. If it's thick enough to where it will, go ahead. So kind of let the amount of residue tell you what you need to do. I only worry about making sure we get a December, January burn done after the first year if we have a bunch of crabgrass or foxtail or some other annual grass that came up in that field, like really, really thick. And then in the winter, that stuff mats down. And if you have a field that looks like, a mat of grass stems by winter, that's the field that you need to try to get burned in December and January. Because if you don't, and if it's a thick mat of those grass stems, it can smother those seedlings trying to come up in year two. But otherwise, if it's not thick enough to even hardly burn, or it won't, not enough fuel to carry a fire, then you should be fine.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to jump around in the questions a bit. So I asked someone yesterday this, but do you have experience using soil solarization on Bermuda?
Only in very small patches, and it can work. But I mean, it has to stay on there for a pretty long period of time. And again, that's really only something that's going to be effective on small areas. You're not going to be able to do a whole field or a large field with that method. And then on the edge, you'll find that those Bermuda plants will reach out with their arms and find the sunlight on the edge too. So even on the edge of that, you won't have a perfect kill because the rhizomes will keep it alive and reach out from underneath that plastic too. But yeah, solarization can absolutely work, and it can be a good option for small area plantings, yards, flower beds, stuff like that. But when you start talking on the scale of acres at a time, it's really just not feasible and extremely expensive to try to purchase that much plastic.
So as a follow-up to that question, what is the cost comparison between solarization and glyphosate?
Ooh, that's going to be hard. So the actual cost of glyphosate per acre at 2 quarts per acre spraying rate is $8. The cost for plastic for an acre's worth of plastic is going to be in the hundreds, if not over $1,000 per acre, likely. That solarization, that thick plastic that can stand up to that use is not cheap. And just when you start talking about acres at a time, it's going to be very expensive. Chemical applications are relatively cheap. Yeah, like I said, so glyphosate costs $8 an acre for the actual chemical, and we normally factor in $10 to $15 per acre to pay somebody to spray it. So you're talking $20 to $25 an acre total cost to get something sprayed with glyphosate. About $60 an acre for arsenal.
Another follow-up question, will Equip cost share the plastic?
Not that I'm aware of. I have not seen any scenario for that for site prep. And site prep for all of our planting practices is included in the cost share for the planting practice itself. So there's not separate cost share for site prep. It's included in that cost. And those average costs are factored on a typical scenario, which I'm sure is factored on chemical applications. So there would be no extra cost share for that through any programs I'm aware of.
Thank you. Is there a general common reason native seedings fail?
So there's a couple aspects to that question. I think a lot of people consider seedings failures when they're not. I don't think they give them enough time. And that works its way into what those reasons are that people think they fail are reasons they could actually fail. Again, native seeding should be done in the dormant season, December and January, to get good seed germination the following year. Most seedings do not happen at that time. People wait and plant stuff in the spring. If you plant in the spring, especially if you get into late spring, mid-April through early June, most of that seed will not germinate, or hardly any of it will at all. And it will look like a failure at the end of the first year. And it will not look all that great at the end of the second year either. So if you do a late spring planting, it's going to take 3 years for it to look good. Whereas a well-timed seeding in December and January, you're going to be a lot happier with that first year result. And by the end of the second year, you're going to have almost a full, normal, nice looking field. So that's one. I think late planting in the spring is a huge issue and a reason why a lot of people think they have failures or are upset with the results that they see. The other kind of common ones I mentioned earlier is just, poor site prep, not getting the non-native stuff killed out, not spraying enough, maybe only sprayed once. So the other, so that stand failure would be you have some natives there, but it's basically taken over immediately by non-native grasses again, which is an issue and extremely hard to deal with after the fact. The other one that I've seen would be people that have drilled the seed too deep or had disked their area and then broadcast after disking without doing rolling or cultipacking. So, in that case, all the seed fell down in these cracks, then it got rained on, and that dirt from the clods washed down in those cracks, and the seed got covered way too deep, never germinated. Or if you drill it too deep, it's not going to germinate. Or what little bit of seed didn't fall into the furrow does germinate, but it's not much. Those are really the main, true failures, to where that seed's buried deep enough to where it's not going to come up until something drastic happens. But otherwise, most of it's either us planting it at the wrong time or not completing site prep like we should.
Great. Can you use cover crops or nurse crops to help establish pollinator plantings in areas with barren soils due to prior disturbance or low organic matter?
You can. I would honestly prefer a couple years of cover crops over the nurse crop. And we might be close to our last question, Leslie. My computer's close to dying on me, but I would go with, if you have a really bad site, I would probably try doing a couple years of cover crops prior to planting natives, and then just plant your natives. I think I mentioned this yesterday, pick native species that do well on poor soils and plant those and be happy with it and let them do their thing, which is also a perfectly viable option and can be very successful. So again, a lot of these native plants do very well on poor soils. There are species that are adapted to very, very poor soils, low nutrient levels, low organic matter. We have plants that are specialists on glades that might very well do good on a barren spot that, they might be out of place, but, if nothing else will grow there, it can work. So, that's a situation where the amount of time, you're talking about trying to do something in a relatively short period of time, but it took 100 years for that site to get degraded to the point where it's at now. And, building soil is on the scale of geologic time, and we're not going to see that. So it's really just, let's try to do the best we can with that site and let it try to improve itself after we've put down some natives on that site, and let it work its thing. Some of these areas, there's just not a lot of easy, feasible options to help bring it back, and we see that a lot. There's a lot of heavily eroded crop sites. I was walking around a field on Sunday that, it was an old field situation, and you could tell it was heavily eroded. Most topsoil was gone. It was down to a clay layer. So the vegetation was thinner. The natives that were there, it was all native, but the native grasses and forbs were significantly shorter than what you're used to seeing them because it was a degraded site. But all those natives still grew fine. Honestly, it was being maintained better for pollinators because the grasses couldn't just absolutely dominate because it was good soil. So those thinner, barren soils, those eroded soils, can be some of our better pollinator sites because those forbs can maintain themselves there without the grasses dominating them so quickly. So I think sometimes we overthink that a bit, but as I got to the edge of this old field and saw where the old edge of the field was, where it met the woods, which had already grown in, it was brushed in 30 feet beyond that. But when I got to the edge of the old field, it was a good 2 feet lower than the soil elevation inside the woods. So, we had lost 2 feet of soil on that field. It was obviously degraded, and you could see it in the plant growth and the community that was there. But again, it looked different than a high quality soil site, but it was still native and it was still doing its thing. And it actually had a lot more native broadleaf plants dominating that field than we saw in the other fields that were higher quality soil. So I don't necessarily see poor soil sites as a bad thing necessarily for Monarch and pollinator management. They might actually be easier to maintain in forb stands than high quality soil sites.
Okay, we'll make it quick since your computer's dying, but this is the last one in the queue. Would you need to spray out a field entirely dominated by broom sedge?
That's a great question, and that's one that we've wrestled with in different situations. Honestly, I would leave that up to the landowner and what they want. So broom sedge is a native warm season grass, and in and of itself is not, it's not inherently evil. It's just a native warm season grass that has seemed to be able to tolerate our human activities and what we've done to soils and nutrient levels and stuff like that in different areas. So, I kind of applaud it because it's stuck around and it's a tough little booger, but it's not an inherently bad thing. It's a native species. It doesn't compete really well when you mix it with a lot of other diversity. So if you set it back a little bit, so on what my approach to a lot of the broom sedge sites is, there's no need to totally knock it out. But, those broom sedge fields can be pretty thick, and just like any other, even if it was a field of solid big blue stem, we need to set it back a good amount to allow the stuff that we're planting to have space and room to grow. And if you have other native grasses and forbs that you're planting there, they'll come in and compete with that broom sedge, and it shouldn't retake over that field. But I'm not as worried about completely eradicating broom sedge, but you're still going to want to knock it back a pretty good amount to make sure that you have enough space for your seedlings that you want to grow there.
Okay, that's it for all of our questions. Thank you so much, Ryan, for sticking around and answering all of them. And thank you to those who stuck it out to the very end. If you have any questions or need any of the documents that we talked about, you can message the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership on Facebook, and I can send you my email address there. Thank you so much for your time, everyone, and thank you for attending the 2020 Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Forum. Have a great day.